G'day, Keith here. Welcome to the Digger History Podcast. At the time that I record this podcast, it is 1 week until Anzac Day 2025. So I thought it would be fitting to do a few Anzac Day related podcasts over the next few days. For the first episode of this series, I'll be talking about how the word Anzac is one of the most protected words in the world, and where the word Anzac can and cannot be used by law. Now, before I get into this topic, for those listeners that aren't from Australia or New Zealand, and I know there's a few out there that are listening, I just want to explain a bit about Anzac and Anzac Day, what that means. So Anzac Day is a national day of remembrance in Australia and New Zealand, and it nowadays it's to commemorate all Australians and New Zealanders who have served in all conflicts. But the original date was to honour the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps who served in the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War. So that date when the original Anzacs landed at Gallipoli was the 25th of April. So Anzac Day is commemorated on the 25th of April every year. Now, this isn't a podcast on the history of the Anzac landings or the Gallipoli campaign, so I won't go into detail about the landings in the campaign. However, the Anzac Day is one of the most, or the most sacred day on the Australian calendar, in my opinion. Around 50,000 Australians and 15,000 New Zealanders were involved in the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, and for two countries that were quite small and quite young at the time, this was a significant percentage of the population. Now there were other countries involved, the British Empire, there were Indians, there were Newfoundlanders and Irish also as part of the British Empire, and French. There were also French there on the Allied side, and then on the Ottoman side, they had the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian. But the reason why this is such a major significance to Australia and New Zealand is because we were two young countries at the time. Australia had only just become federated around 15 years earlier, or 14 years earlier in 1901. So it was the first major military involvement for the new country. So yes, a very, very significant day in Australia and New Zealand history. And the day is commemorated with services all over Australia and New Zealand in big cities and little towns alike. There's services in big places like in Sydney that have tens of thousands of people attending, and then little country towns have small services, because there's even little country towns had people that served in conflicts all around the world, in all the conflicts since the Gallipoli campaign. So it's a big thing in both countries. So that brings me to the topic of this podcast, which is the protection of the word Anzac, and how it can and cannot be used. So even as early as 1916, 1 year after the Gallipoli landings, it was felt that the word Anzac should be protected from commercialisation, otherwise it would lose its meaning and significance to the Australian and New Zealand public, as well as to the soldiers who served. So regulations came into effect about the ways in which the word Anzac could not be used. So in July 1916 it became an offence to use the word ANZAC or a word similar to ANZAC in trade or in business. The regulations also prohibited branding, the ANZAC branding on your home or your boat or your vehicle. So two of the first examples of a breach of these regulations were both in 1916. So the owner of a photo studio called his photo company the ANZAC Art Photo Enlargement Company. So he was the first known person to be prosecuted for this offence, and he did appeal unsuccessfully. So was the first person to be prosecuted and found guilty of this offence. And around the same time, the owner of a cafe called his cafe the ANZAC Cafe, and also was prosecuted for this. And even in recent years, there's still examples of companies and businesses in breach of this regulation. You may remember in 2015 the supermarket Woolworths brought out a Fresh in Our Memories ANZAC campaign, which was copped a lot of backlash, and they took the campaign down. So nowadays the word ANZAC, to use the word ANZAC in any commercial situation, you need to apply to the Department of Veteran Affairs, and usually the answer is no. They're very protective, and rightly so, of the word ANZAC. So in 1921, the Protection of the Word ANZAC Act came into effect, and the you can Google like all the wording of the Protection of the Word ANZAC Act and read the act yourself. So it covers the incorrect use of the word ANZAC, exemptions that can be used. So some examples of exemptions, say if there's a street, for example, where I grew up, there's a street called ANZAC Avenue, and if you had a store on the ANZAC Avenue, you can call that the ANZAC Avenue store, but you cannot call that the ANZAC store. Or if you had a restaurant and you're serving lunch on ANZAC Day, you could put an ANZAC Day lunch on your menu, but you cannot put ANZAC lunch. So you can use the word ANZAC in relation to the day, but not as a standalone word. Another exemption for the use of the word ANZAC is for like historical or commemorative or educational purposes. For example, as I do this podcast now, this isn't for commercial purposes. I'm not making any money out of this. I'm just doing this as like an educational kind of thing. So that is permitted under the Act. So New Zealand has similar laws under Section 17 of the Flags, Emblems and Name Protection Act of 1981. The laws are quite similar to that of Australia in how the word ANZAC is to be protected. And actually in 2003, Australia and New Zealand also petitioned the World Intellectual Property Organisation to make the word ANZAC a restricted word in all over the world. So all the countries that are signatory to the World Intellectual Property Organisation are to refuse any trade, to register any trademarks with the word ANZAC in them. So if you listen to a previous podcast I made on the history of the ANZAC biscuit, you'll know that I briefly touched on how the word ANZAC is allowed to be used for commercial purposes when selling Anzac biscuits, and that is the only general exemption for commercialisation of the word Anzac. But there are caveats to that. So Anzac biscuits can only be called biscuits or slice. They cannot be called cookies or anything else. They're just either biscuits or slice, and they cannot deviate greatly from the original recipe or even the shape. So you can't make Anzac biscuits in novelty shapes. You can't put chocolate chips in them and still call them Anzac biscuits. I guess you can put chocolate chips in them and call them something completely different, but you can't call them and sell them as Anzac biscuits. In fact, a few years ago, Subway got in trouble for using a different recipe for their Anzac biscuits, and they decided that to make them under the traditional recipe was too expensive, so they pulled them from their menu. If you do want to hear more about the history of the Anzac biscuits, scroll back through my previous episodes. There's one there on the Anzac biscuit, and you'll notice it stands out because I have a picture of the Anzac biscuit in the thumbnail there. But that's quite an interesting episode. I quite enjoyed researching that, and I even did a bit of cooking. Found the original first published recipe and cooked some Anzac biscuits. So I hope you enjoyed that really short, brief episode on the protection of the word Anzac. As I said, I will be bringing out a few more Anzac related episodes over the next week, building up to Anzac Day. If there's anything you would like me to do a podcast on, please feel free to pop in the comments and put your suggestions forward. I really enjoyed doing research for these topics, so I learn a bit myself as well in doing these podcasts. So reach out with your suggestions. If you know of anyone that would be interested in this podcast, please share it with them. Please subscribe, follow this podcast. It kind of makes my kind of stats go up a little bit, which kind of inspires me to do more podcasts. So please hit the subscribe button and do all those things that you do. Thanks again for listening to this podcast. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.